Most snacks are just average. And once you start paying attention, it becomes very clear that only a few actually feel worth buying again. Nature. Valley Crunchy bars are one of those snacks you've probably seen everywhere. And because of how they look, most people already have an expectation before even trying them. They feel simple, a bit more natural, a bit more controlled compared to most options on the shelf. And that alone makes people assume they're a better choice. Something you can grab without thinking too much about it. Something that fits into your day without feeling like a bad decision. But this is where things get interesting, because a lot of snacks rely only on that first impression, and don't really deliver after that. And this is where most people get it wrong. Because with this one, the experience actually holds up. When you open the package, it smells clean, slightly sweet, very familiar. Nothing artificial or overwhelming, and that already puts it in a different position compared to most snacks. But this is where things usually fall apart with other products, because they smell good, they look right. But once you start eating them, the experience doesn't really match, and that's the part most people don't pay attention to. But here, it actually carries through. When you take the first bite, it's crunchy, slightly crumbly, a bit dry at first, and that's something people either like or don't. But this is where the difference shows up, because instead of becoming heavy or overwhelming, it stays light, simple, and easy to eat. And that simplicity is exactly what makes it work over time. Not just in the first bite, but throughout the entire experience. And this is where things start to shift. Because most snacks either go too far in one direction. They're too sweet, too processed, too intense, or they try too hard to feel healthy and end up losing the enjoyment. But this one sits in the middle. It doesn't try to impress you, it just works. And that's a very different kind of value. And this is the part nobody really talks about. Because when a snack is simple, like these, it doesn't immediately stand out in a dramatic way. It's not something that hits you and feels amazing right away. But over time, as you keep eating it, you start to appreciate that consistency, that predictability, the fact that it always delivers the same kind of experience without becoming too much dot. If you've ever had a snack that felt good at first, but you didn't want to finish it, you know exactly what I mean. And that's where this one separates itself. Because instead of being something you try once and forget, it becomes something you can actually go back to without thinking twice. Something that fits into your routine without creating friction. And that's something most people are actually looking for, even if they don't describe it that way. And once you start comparing it to other options in the same category, that's where the difference becomes even more obvious. Because you begin to notice how many of them rely on being overly sweet or overly processed to feel satisfying. While this one works in a much more balanced way, it doesn't try too hard. It just delivers something that makes sense from start to finish. And that's where the value becomes clear. Not because it's perfect, not because it's the best thing you've ever had, but because it consistently does what it's supposed to do, and does it in a way that holds up over time. And once you notice that, it changes how you look at similar snacks. Because instead of focusing on what looks better or sounds better, you start paying attention to what actually works in the long run. And that shift is subtle, but it makes a big difference. Because instead of choosing based on habit, you start choosing based on experience, and that's where better decisions start to happen. Not just with snacks, but with everything you buy regularly. And once that clicks, it's hard to ignore it the next time you're standing in front of a shelf trying to decide what to grab. And the next one works in a completely different way. And that's where things get even more interesting. Popcorners are one of those snacks most people overlook. They're usually sitting there on the shelf without calling much attention. Simple packaging, simple idea. And that's exactly why people skip them. Because they don't look indulgent. They don't look premium. They just look basic. And most people assume that means they're not worth it. And this is where people get it wrong. Because once you actually try them, the experience is very different from what you expect. And that's what makes them stand out more than people realize. Because instead of feeling heavy or overly processed like most snacks in this category, they feel light, crisp, and surprisingly clean, and that changes the way you consume them almost immediately. The texture is the first thing you notice. It's crunchy, but not hard. It breaks easily. It doesn't feel dense. And that alone already puts it in a different position compared to chips or other similar snacks, because you don't get that heavy, greasy feeling after a few bites. Instead, it feels lighter, more controlled. Something you can keep eating without it becoming too much. And this is where things start to shift, because most snacks rely heavily on flavor to carry the experience. They're often salty, oily, or artificially intense. But here, the balance is different. The flavor is there, but it doesn't try to dominate everything. It works with the texture instead of overpowering it, and that creates a more satisfying experience over time, not just in the first few bites. And this is the part most people don't notice at first, because a lot of snacks taste good immediately but don't hold up after a few minutes. They become too heavy, too repetitive, or just not enjoyable anymore. But with this one, the experience stays consistent. It doesn't wear you out. And that makes a bigger difference than people think. And if you've ever had a snack that felt good at first but you didn't want to finish it, you know exactly what this fixes. And that's where the value becomes clear. Because instead of being something you try once and forget, it becomes something you can actually go back to without thinking twice. And that's what most people are really looking for, even if they don't describe it that way. And this is where things become even more obvious, because once you start comparing it to other options in the same category, you begin to notice how many of them rely on being overly intense to feel satisfying, while this one works in a more balanced way. It doesn't try too hard. It just delivers something that feels right from start to finish. And that's surprisingly rare. And once you start noticing that, it changes how you look at similar snacks, because you stop focusing only on flavor and start paying attention to how the experience actually holds up over time. And that's where this one earns its place. Not because it's exciting, but because it works consistently. And that consistency is what most people end up valuing without even realizing it. Now the next one is different, and this is where familiarity starts to play a much bigger role. Ritz crackers are one of those snacks that almost everyone has tried at some point. They've been around forever. They're simple, they're familiar. And because of that, most people don't really think about them anymore. They just see them as something basic, something that's always been there. But this is where it gets interesting, because when you actually pay attention to what they deliver, you start to realize there's a reason they've lasted this long. And it's not just habit. The texture is light, slightly flaky, easy to eat, and the flavor sits right in the middle between salty and buttery, without going too far in either direction. And that balance is what makes them so easy to come back to. And this is where most snacks fail. They try to stand out too much. Stronger flavor, more intensity, more variation. But over time, that becomes tiring, while this one does the opposite. It keeps things simple. And that simplicity is exactly what makes it work. And once you compare it to snacks that try too hard to be different, you begin to notice how many of them lose that balance. They might be interesting at first, but they don't have the same staying power. And this is the key point. A good snack isn't just about the first impression. It's about how it holds up over time, how often you want to go back to it, and how easily it fits into your routine. And that's where this one continues to deliver. And the next one takes this even further. Planters peanuts are one of those snacks that almost everyone recognizes. They've been around for a long time. They're easy to find, and for a lot of people, they're just a default option. Something you grab without thinking too much about it. And because of that, they often get overlooked. Not because they're bad, but because they feel too familiar to stand out. And this is where things start to change, because when you actually pay attention to what they deliver, you begin to understand why they've stayed relevant for so long. And it's not just because people are used to them. It's because they consistently do something very simple in a way that actually works. The texture is firm, slightly crunchy, but not too hard. And the flavor is balanced in a way that feels natural. Not overly salty, not artificial, just straightforward and satisfying. And that simplicity is exactly what makes it reliable. And this is where most snacks start to fall apart, because they try to stand out by adding more. More flavor, more intensity, more variation, but often end up losing that balance. While this one does the opposite, it keeps things simple, and that's exactly why it works over time. And this is the part nobody really talks about. When you eat something regularly, you're not looking for something that surprises you every time. You're looking for something that you can trust, something that delivers the same experience without making you question your choice. And that's exactly what this does. And once you start paying attention to that, it becomes very clear that consistency is not just about being the same. It's about being reliably good in a way that fits into your routine without friction. And that's something that's much harder to find than it seems, because a lot of snacks either become too much over time or don't hold up after a few tries. But this one stays steady, and that steadiness is what keeps people coming back, even if they don't consciously think about it. And once you compare it to other snacks in the same category, that's where the difference becomes even more obvious. Because you begin to notice how many of them either go too far with seasoning or feel inconsistent from one bite to the next. But here, you get the same experience every time, and that matters more than people think. And this is where things start to shift again, because the next one works in a completely different way. And this is one a lot of people see as a better option from the start. Kind bars are one of those snacks that already come with an expectation. People assume they're cleaner, more controlled, something closer to a smarter choice. And in many cases, that's true. But what makes them stand out is not just the image. It's how they actually hold up when you eat them regularly. Because when you look at them, you can actually see what's inside. Nuts, pieces, texture, and that alone changes the experience. It feels less processed, less artificial, and more intentional. And that makes a difference. And this is where most snack bars fail. They try to look better than they actually are. But when you eat them, they still feel overly processed or too sweet. But here, the balance is different. It's sweet, but not overwhelming. It has texture, but not in a way that makes it hard to eat. And that combination makes it something you can actually keep buying without getting tired of it. And once you compare it to other bars in the same category, that's where the difference becomes even clearer. Because you start to notice how many of them either go too far into sweetness or too far into trying to be healthy and lose the enjoyment. But this one manages to stay in the middle, and that's exactly what makes it work. And when you look at all of these snacks together, that's where the pattern becomes obvious.